Hello, my name is Carly Robinson. I work in the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Scientific and Technical Information, and I'm the Assistant Director for Information Products and Services. It's wonderful to be with you all today. So I'm going to be talking about global resolvable research persistent identifiers, specifically digital object identifiers or DOIs, as an analog to Internet of Things resolvers that you all think a lot about in your community. So to kick things off, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about persistent identifiers in the open science space, which is the area that I focus on. And so persistent identifiers in our space, or PIDs as we call them, are defined as digital identifiers that are globally unique, persistent, machine resolvable, have an associated metadata schema, identify an entity, and is frequently used to disambiguate between identities. And disambiguation is really a key part of persistent identifiers in the open space. It's truly helpful in that respect. So the identifier itself is a string of numbers, letters, and or symbols assigned to a digital object. And in a couple of slides, I'm going to show kind of examples of some of these persistent identifiers. So our community sees a lot of benefits to assigning and using persistent identifiers in this kind of research science atmosphere. And some of the benefits that we see are enabling research to be more open, discoverable, and accessible when it makes sense to be. And the metadata or information that is describing those research aspects are publicly accessible and available. So the information kind of, for example, describing a research output needs to be publicly available. Persistent identifiers are also stable, persistent links that allow for metadata or that information to be updated as needed without actually changing the higher level persistent identifier. They also allow organizations to track awards, research outputs, and researchers, which can be extremely helpful to see return on investment or better understand the impact of the research or the funding. And then one of the really exciting things is by linking all of these persistent identifiers together, you can really create connections throughout the research lifecycle. So you'll have persistent identifiers for people connected to persistent identifiers for awards, connected to persistent identifiers for organizations and research outputs and peer review. And all of these connections using persistent identifiers can be really powerful. So to quickly talk about a couple different types of persistent identifiers that we use in the research and science space. This is not by any means an extensive list. They're just a few of the very common identifiers that we use. So the first are digital object identifiers, or DOIs, which are persistent identifiers for research outputs or awards. And this might be the most common type that you all are familiar with in this space. DOIs are almost always assigned to journal articles. So you might see the DOI associated with a journal article. DOIs are based on an ISO standard. And they have an international DOI foundation, which is the high-level management body for all DOIs that are assigned. And under the International DOI Foundation, there are registration agencies, which actually kind of register the DOIs with the International DOI Foundation. So Crossref and DataCite are both registration agencies under the International DOI Foundation. Crossref is a membership organization. Their members are primarily publishers, funders, and they assign DOIs primarily to text-based research outputs. So think journal articles, conference papers, technical reports, workshop reports, things like that. They also provide a service assigning DOIs to awards, grants, and contracts. DataCite is another registration agency. Their members are typically data repositories, universities, or funders. And the DataCite DOIs are most often assigned to data sets and to software, but more commonly are being assigned to gray literature as well. So that's the DOI space, but there are a couple other identifiers that we commonly work with in open science. One is Orchid identifiers, which are persistent identifiers for people. Orchid IDs are also based on an ISO standard. It is free for any researcher to get an Orchid ID, completely free for them to get an ID and to have an Orchid record that contains information that describes the researcher, basically an online CV. But they also have membership organizations such as universities, funders, or government organizations that are Orchid members, which have the ability through their membership to get permission to interact with those researcher Orchid records. And then lastly, I want to mention Research Organization Registry IDs, or ROR IDs, which are persistent identifiers for organizations participating in research. This is a relatively new persistent identifier in this space, but there's a lot of community buy-in and use on this already. ROR is a completely community-led organization at this point, and there are no members so far. So I thought it would be helpful to actually show you what these persistent identifiers look like and the information associated with them. So in the kind of upper left-hand corner screenshot, you can see this is a DOI for a journal article. So these persistent identifiers are resolvable. So the DOI is in the light green box. So if you click on that, it resolves to this landing page. And in this case, a landing page about a journal article. So all of these persistent identifiers need to resolve to what we call a landing page. In this case, it's hosted by the publisher who assigned the DOI. And you'll see information or metadata describing that journal article and a link to the actual journal article itself. So you'll see the title, the authors, of which I'm one of the authors, and you see the journal information, and you can get access to the PDF, whether it's for free or, maybe you need a subscription or need to pay for it. And then in the bottom right-hand side is an example of a DOI assigned to an award. And my organization, OSTI, we assign award DOI, so we host this landing page. So if you click on that award DOI, it'll take you to this page, and we have information describing the award. So for example, the name, the description, the investigator names, their affiliations, the awarding organization, things like that. So you're going to see this concept for all of these persistent identifiers. You have the resolvable identifier that takes you to a landing page where there's information that describes whatever that persistent identifier is assigned to. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the structure of the DOI, which I think might be helpful. So it's kind of broken up into different pieces. So the first part of a DOI and these other types of persistent identifiers is the actual resolver service. So in the case of a DOI, all DOIs are registered through the International DOI Foundation, and they provide the resolver service. Next is this prefix, this 10 dot something number. The prefix is assigned by the registration agency, so Crossref or DataCite. These are unique numbers, and they are given or assigned to organizations that are members of the registration agency. So for example, my office within the Department of Energy, we are members of both Crossref and DataCite. So both those organizations give us prefixes that we can use when we are giving out those DOIs. There's also an option to have an infix, which is an optional string that can be provided by the organization that either creates the research object or provides the funding, or by the DOI assignment organization. And this is totally optional, but it's something that you can put in there. Sometimes it's helpful to have some kind of internal intelligence in there, though it's not necessarily recommended to build in intelligence, but it's this optional piece that you can put in there. And lastly is the suffix, and this is the string provided by the DOI assignment organization. So in my case, Department of Energy, we assign that suffix. It's often the internal identifier. So for example, my office, OSTI, the Office of Scientific and Technical Information, we have our own OSTI ID, an internal identifier. And so in our case, that number that starts with a 6, that's our own internal identifier. So moving on from DOIs, I wanted to show an example of an Orchid ID. This is my personal Orchid identifier. Again, that persistent identifier, the Orchid ID is resolvable. So when you click on that, you are taken to this landing page that has information about me on it because it's a persistent identifier for a person. So you can see my name, my aliases, other names I've published under, or variations of my name, my bio, my biography, employment information, educational information, funding, and all of my research outputs. And I get to control what information is in this, in my Orchid record. And then lastly, I want to show you an example of a research organization registry ID, which again is a persistent identifier for a research organization. In this case, my office, OSTI. You can see the ROR identifier up in the upper right-hand corner. And so if you were to click on that link, it will resolve to this page. It has just some basic information, our office, our acronym, our website, the fact that we are in the United States and that we're a government organization. They also have some other organization identifiers listed there. So now that you've kind of seen examples of these persistent identifiers, I thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about ownership and responsibility in which organizations that are a part of these persistent identifiers have responsibility. So over on the right-hand side, you'll see some of the kind of hierarchies for each of these identifiers that I thought might be helpful to think about ownership and responsibility. And DOIs are by far the most complicated because you have multiple levels. You have kind of the International DOI Foundation, you have the registration agencies, and then you have kind of member organizations underneath that. And so they have, various responsibilities. So for the actual assignment of the persistent identifier, that responsibility goes to the member organizations. And the reason that they have that responsibility is because they need to actually collect the metadata or information and pass that on to the registration agencies to actually register that DOI. The responsibility for the DOI registration is with those registration agencies. So for example, DataCite and Crossref, they need to pass on that metadata and register that DOI with the International DOI Foundation. Now the resolver infrastructure is all hosted in this case by the International DOI Foundation. They are doing the resolving. Going back to kind of the landing pages that the DOIs resolve to, the responsibility for that is with the member organization. So for example, the publishers or offices like mine that are actually kind of assigning those DOIs and passing that information on to the registration agency. And then if you want to kind of update the metadata associated with that DOI or the information, that again is the responsibility of the membership organization. So, researchers can request updates. So for example, let's say a researcher changes their name. They can request that their name be updated, but they need to work with the member organization. So for example, the publishing organization to get their name updated. Now, moving on to Orchid IDs, it becomes a little bit less complicated because Orchid itself maintains a lot of this ownership and responsibility. So the actual persistent identifier assignment is done by Orchid, but only at the request of a researcher. So only the researcher themselves can request an Orchid ID. Orchid has responsibility for the registration of the Orchid identifier. They host the resolving infrastructure, and they also host those landing pages. Now, one of the differences here is that metadata or information associated with the Orchid ID, that can be updated and should be updated only by the researcher or organizations that the researcher gives permission to update that information. And then moving on to ROR IDs, it's simplified even more because ROR kind of has all of the responsibility. ROR assigns the ROR IDs, the persistent identifiers, again, only when requested by an organization or a researcher at an organization to assign a ROR ID to their organization. They do the PID registration, they host the resolving infrastructure, they host the landing page. And if a researcher or organization requests an update to the associated metadata or information, ROR will make those updates. So, there are many different levels and responsibilities, but, I think it's helpful to really understand who has responsibility for which piece. So we've kind of talked about ownership and who has responsibility for the information that's associated with these persistent identifiers. But there's actually a lot of work going on kind of outside those organizations that have responsibility to add to, enhance, or correct metadata. For example, abstracts are getting added, research organization aliases are being added. So for example, UC Berkeley is the same thing as University of California, Berkeley. Funding information is getting added. Research output connections are being added. So, connecting journal articles to the associated data sets or software. And this work is being done by organizations like university libraries, funders, data repositories, institutional repositories, but they don't have responsibility or ownership of those persistent identifiers. So all of this enhanced metadata kind of lives currently outside of those identifiers. They're not, the metadata associated with those identifiers are not being updated because they're not the owners. But it's really important, really valuable work that's being done. And so one of the things that I have been talking to the persistent identifier organizations about is potentially this idea of creating an enhanced metadata layer so that, those organizations that are the owners, the original owners of the metadata, that information is not overwritten. But there's kind of this layer that sits on top that the larger community can benefit from. All of this great work that is being done, but kind of currently living in internal systems, not of use to the larger community. And there's a lot of ways to do this. You can track metadata provenance, you can capture contributing organizations or people who are, enhancing or adding to this metadata. And it's very much an open question on who might host this kind of infrastructure to have this metadata layer, but it's something that I think a lot of the persistent identifier organizations are interested in, but it's in the early stages of those conversations. So I mentioned early on, kind of in my benefits slide, that you can create connections using persistent identifiers through the research lifecycle. To really help understand impact or tell a story. And that's one thing that we're working to do at the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Scientific and Technical Information. We're trying to connect all of this information using persistent identifiers. So we host a search tool called OSTI.gov, which is where you can find all of the publicly available DOE funded research outputs. And this is just one example. It's a journal article with kind of typical information that you'd find about a journal article. It has the title, it has the authors, research organization, sponsoring organization, award numbers, things like that. And, much of this is just text-based right now, which is very valuable, but it would be even more wonderful if we had persistent identifiers associated with all this information. So that's what we're working to do. So for this journal article, we have the DOI that's associated with it that was assigned by the publisher. We're working to add research organization registry IDs or ROR IDs for the research and sponsoring organizations. We're working to add Orchid IDs for all of the authors and researchers associated with this. We want to have DOIs for the grants or award numbers instead of just these internal numbers that don't mean as much to other folks. And then, this publication has associated data sets and software, and we want to make sure that we have DOIs for those. And so we're capturing all of this information on this journal article record page, which is really great to have it there. But we also offer APIs so that others can use this information, and you can do a lot of really cool things with this information. For example, visualize it and start exploring the connection. So this is a different journal article, but this is just one example of kind of the visualization work that we're starting to do. So you have the journal article at the center, you have all of the connected authors through their Orchid IDs, all of the connected organizations through their ROR IDs, all of the funding connected through the award numbers, citations and references connected through DOIs. And it's just really helpful when you visualize it to start having these connections and exploring them. And, you can kind of redraw this visualization. So a specific funding award is in the center and all of the, PIs associated with that award. Or you can see, this specific author, all of their other publications. You kind of can redraw these visualizations. And it's just really exciting to be able to do this using persistent identifiers. Going back to the disambiguation piece, right? So you can imagine there are a lot of John Smiths in the world. And knowing exactly which John Smith you're talking about by having their specific Orchid ID can really help with the disambiguation piece and really help to understand impact of funding or of a specific research output. So that's kind of where we are right now. We're starting to explore how using all of these persistent identifiers can help in that respect. And with that, I just want to thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. I know it's a little bit different than kind of some of the other topics here, but hopefully you all can kind of see the analogs using persistent identifiers for kind of this open science space. So thank you so much. And whenever it's time, I am happy to take any questions. Thank you.